Thank you so much, Francois, and thank you for hosting me in your Aspect book series. I'm really excited to be here today. So I feel like I'm talking about something radically different here, because I'm going to talk about animals for probably the most of what I have to say here. My book is called Animal Constructions and Technological Knowledge. It's a philosophy of technology book. Philosophy of technology is a field that studies sort of the social implications of socio-technical systems. It looks at sort of questions of how we encapsulate knowledge with the machinery we have, questions about know-how, and how emerging technologies are going to affect us all. And how does this relate to animals? I was annoyed all the time. I was annoyed because every time we talked about philosophy of technology, we were talking about philosophy of engineering immediately. The immediate move on the part of philosophers of technology was usually to say, well, defining technology is really hard, but we know engineers do it, so let's just look at engineering. And that is not what technology is, right? So that's one class of technology. So I was annoyed a lot of the time, and I was also reading in literature about the history of nanotechnology and about emerging technologies, and every moment of the day people were saying things like, well, if you look at the strength of a spider's web, we should be able as human beings to replicate this in the things that we make. So at the same time that engineers are going to make these great things based on nature, you're having all of these narratives that float around about how humans are also superior to animals in the things we make. And I was annoyed, right? I was annoyed because, in fact, in the past 30 years, we've seen an explosion of animal studies research that tells us that animals make and do things that philosophers haven't appreciated for a very long time. And that the things that animals do and make are much more complicated than were once appreciated. So we were living with this old model about how animals related to philosophy and whether animals could actually know things. And if you wanted to talk comprehensively about the things non-human animals did, then you were anthropomorphizing in a way. So I started by thinking about, and in the book I started about, the first few chapters are sort of setting this up. So I look at a lot of the definitions in the book that philosophers and historians of technology have posed, trying to define not only what technology is, but what humans are. So when you have definitions about humans and what we are that are homo faber, man the maker, right, that we need to move into this mode. And when you have historians saying things like, man made the tools, but tools made the man, the sort of things that we were seeing at the same time in animal studies, that people are making these definitions about technology that exclude animals and what they make as being non-technological in character. You're also talking about what it is to be human, as if human beings are always tied up with tools and technological systems. So I wanted to actually think about this animal studies literature and think about it in terms of philosophy of technology. What are these tools we have out of philosophy of technology that maybe got this early definitional part wrong? I think I make that argument in the book. But what would they actually have to say about these animal cases? I look at it particularly through questions of technological knowledge, which is a subject that's been explored in philosophy of technology. But these animal cases could be taken to other parts of philosophy of technology and philosophy of science to say interesting things about those. But I wanted to spend time reviewing a lot of the animal studies literature to make these sorts of claims. And these claims are relevant because they force us to ask questions about learning in relationship to technology. They ask questions about folk physics and causal understandings and reasoning that often we don't appreciate that non-human animals might have. We can ask cultural questions. When we see varieties of tool use being used by different groups that exist in social communities, we can ask questions about cultural change in technology use. We can also ask about sort of detachability and abstraction that comes from tool use and language. And we can talk about even things like innovation. Because, in fact, in the animal cases and some of the ones that I bring in, new uses of tools are discovered in animal groups and then transmitted. So questions of cultural transmission with technology using non-human case studies in this case. I look at three primary areas. So there's been 2 volumes published in 2011 and 2012. There were these books that it's just like catalogs of known animal tool use. One is called Animal Tool Behavior, and I'm going to flake on the other one right now. but one was an update from a 1980 book that was much slimmer by Benjamin Beck, who sort of worked on animal tool use, and they filled in with all the additional cases that had been discovered since the 1980s, so 30 years of new material on this. And there was a similar publication that came the year later that looked more in depth at a few of these case studies. So I was really interested in areas that we had a lot of research, right? Because it's great to speculate, but in fact, we could say much more interesting things about the sorts of things I was interested in if the cases were well thought out. So we have a lot of ape and primate research that's been collected since 1960 when Jane Goodall first witnessed ant dipping in Gombe after 45 months embedded there. Ant dipping, I'll get to that in a second. The second case that I really wanted to look at was cetaceans. So whales, porpoises, and dolphins, we don't think of them as tool users because in fact, they don't have hands, right? They don't have beaks, the sort of things you might fashion and shape objects with. We know a lot about, say, whale songs and cultural transmission of melody and things like that, but there actually came a case of we know a lot about dolphin techniques, a case of a tool used by dolphins that spread in a particular group in the mid-2000s that I thought was really worth investigating. I also looked at birds, so New Caledonian crows are a type of corvid that uses a wide variety of tools and tools for different tasks in important ways, and can produce novel tools in experimental environments. So these are the three sorts of areas that I drew from in the research that I brought in to analyze. Highlights from these, in your ape and primate cases, you have, the assumption is often that it was rare, that chimpanzees particularly would use tools. We know from Jane Goodall's research and research since that time that it's actually that human beings being in the space means that chimps and other animals don't act in a normal way, right? So it actually manipulates the behavior to have an observer there in a particular way. It took 45 months of Jane Goodall just hanging out in Gombe to get the group that she was studying to do what was a pretty normal task, use a sort of stick probe tool fashioned with branches, like twigs cut off, pulled off, to insert it in an ant or termite mound. Have ants climb up it, you get a snack, right? So ant dipping is this actually really common thing in different primate groups, and so this sort of kicks off a whole bunch of research. Oh no, we're not the only tool user. I mean, anyone with a cat will actually tell you about stories about cats using tools. I don't talk about cats in my book. I tried to look at wild cases that aren't like, that haven't observed humans first, right? So that's why it's all wild animals, in fact, that I end up pulling through in this book. But to look at these sorts of things, and it's not just that they use probe tools. So Cricket Sands and her groups in Congo have actually discovered in 2009 a particular group of chimps using toolkits. So different cultural groups will have different preferences for probe tools, some longer, some shorter, sometimes dependent on what they're seeking to pull out, but not always. So even with the same sorts of materials available, particular groups will prefer longer tools and longer dip sessions, but then you get the thing, or tinier stick tools to pull shorter ones, but then you do more dipping at a time, right? Just differences in how you might do that. Cricket Sands and her group in the Congo found toolkits where a particular group was using one long stick tool to cut open a mound, an ant mound, and flipping the top of it over, and then using a second tool to ant dip. With the mound completely open, you could get like a lot more ants at a time, and then once you were done, you would flip it back, and this was called, in fact, a sustainable form of ant dipping, because, in fact, if you flip the nest back, the ants don't leave as quickly, so if you do enough ant dipping, the ants find somewhere else to hang out. If you flipped it back over, they wouldn't flee as quickly, so that you could exploit a nest for a much longer period of time. So this concerted use of tools, tools used in concert, was part of the discovery that Cricket Sands and her group were finding. We also have lots of in captivity primate and ape cases, particularly among gray apes. We know about cocoa and language studies, but Kanzi, who was at the same facility, was taught to flake stone tools in ways that had been discovered at ancient sites. He was said to have come up with, he's a gorilla, he was said to come up with his own method of flaking, because the researchers tried to show him, and if you could cut open, if you made the right tool, you'd cut open a box, and the box would have a treat in it. And they were trying to show him how to flake the particular stone tool so that he could do this task. He did, right? This was someone trying to actually show that it's possible to teach gorillas to use tools and not only use them, but make them. He came up with his own technique, which involved throwing the rock at a particular angle that it would break in such a way that he could then open the box for the treat. And questions about whether this was an innovative thing, whether this was intentioned, came up at that point. We also know about planning from different zoo animals who have hidden objects that they could throw at zoo goers from their habitat, which we talk about extensively. The cetacean cases. So we have, I mentioned this dolphin case of tool use. It's called sponging. It's where a dolphin goes to the bottom of the seafloor, knocks off the top of a sponge, uses it over its rostrum, goes back down, and uses the object over its rostrum to scare up some fish from the bottom of the surface. You're scared up, you get a snack, right? But this was found in only one particular group, and it was found only within one particular family that hung out together, mostly in the macrolines. So it ended up being a whole bunch of related dolphins. They did a whole bunch of genetic analyses to try to argue that this was actually a culturally shared taught technique from mother to daughter, rather than being something that was instinctive in any way. So using it, and we know of lots of different dolphin techniques that work this way, but the actual employment of a tool in this case is notable. We also have these birds cases. So this had questions about questions of innovation really came up here. If you discover a new technique, what counts as innovative? Then the bird cases, mostly corvids here, about learning to use tools. There's a whole bunch of great studies by Gavin Hunt and Russell D. Gray, as well as a host of other people about New Caledonian crows. In the wild, they were found to have, for at least, they make different types of tools. Some are based on leaves, some are based on twigs for different tasks. New Caledonian crows are known to be prolific tool users in the wild, and there seems to be standardization in the tools. So the tools, they'll go back and get a particularly good one in the eyes of the researchers and use it again for the same task, seeing it as particularly useful. They'll also make similar forms over and over to do these sorts of tasks. At one point, researchers described a 10-step tool making process that this group was engaged in at one point. They talk about the crafting of these tools as being a taught tradition where youngsters watch older crows do these sorts of things. They talk about how folk physics is involved in this, so sort of rudimentary understandings of causation in physics, what you expect to happen. They talk about sort of redesigning and not how it's not simply trial and error, right? So especially in some lower primate cases, the making of tools in laboratory environments will go through several processes and they'll just keep trying until something works. And these studies have been done with capuchins. Not so. It's not as easy to say that about the great ape cases. That's orangutans, gorillas, humans, and chimpanzees. It's even harder to say in the bird cases, especially what they witnessed with New Caledonian crows, with hook tools set up for devices where you had to use the hook tool to actually push food away. It's much harder for the capuchins to push food away, for it to drop and get it, than it is for the crows, who often need fewer cycles of training on a particular object to see how it might work, which suggests something like understanding. So they talk about, the researchers talk about this in terms of folk physics. The New Caledonian research is really exciting, but maybe they're just weird, right? So this is weird. Well, humans and New Caledonian crows might be really good tool users, right? But they've actually found out they've put rooks through similar tests. So rooks who aren't known to use any tools in the wild, these sort of tube treat tasks that New Caledonian crows have shown to be really adept at. They can even fashion novel materials they haven't come into contact before to do these sorts of exercises. Rooks can do it too in laboratory settings. it points to the fact that actually tools aren't always useful. We think about tools as these things that make us really, really smart, right? Man made the tools, tools made the man, and all of these sorts of narratives we tell ourselves about what humans do and the appropriate work that we have. In fact, tools aren't useful for a lot of species in the wild because carrying something extra around doesn't always work to your survival advantage. So even at the same time we're like blowing it up about animal studies research and about how like, well, humans are super smart in all these technological ways. In fact, it might be smarter under a wide variety of ecological niches not to be carrying around a coconut, right? So there's lots of exciting research in that direction. I tried to use some contrast cases in the book. So what we know about beaver dams has been really exciting. This is an example. I talk about beaver dams, spider webs, and about nest construction and building, because a lot of times tool use, the big thing is about detachability, right? But there's, in fact, most species make habitats, and we don't think about them as very smart or intelligent things to do. But there's actually, I mean, cognitively, to think about detachability usually doesn't lead to any survival advantage. So to say things about intelligence based on these findings about how other animals might not be as smart as we are doesn't actually make any sense. I sort of digress. So the beaver dam case, I think, is really interesting. I actually call it trading spaces beaver initiative. I like jokes. So these researchers were interested in finding out what beavers did if you switched their habitats. So they took a beaver group that was known to build dams, lived near a stream, they knew how to do it. They took a beaver group that was not making dams, did not live near a stream, and they switched them. They just moved. They moved the beavers, and the beavers that moved to the stream were building dams like they were supposed to at that point, and the group that wasn't, that had gotten moved, they didn't start felling trees, right, without the stream present. So then they took it to the next level, and they got a tape recording of the noise of streams, put it in the area where there was no dam building activity, there was no stream, and they played the music overnight, and overnight there was a whole bunch of trees felled over the recording of stream rushing. A lot of schools that have beavers as mascots talk about how smart beavers are, because beavers do always build at the narrowest part of the stream, but that's where it's loudest, right? So we're going to do that tree felling activity. It's not that beavers couldn't be smart in other ways, but their tool use, their construction isn't necessarily the same indicator of it that it's often taken for. I do talk about human bias and anthropocentrism, because at this point you're saying, well, she should worry about that. But we can also go too far the other way, and I think that's been the history of animal studies, especially in concert with philosophy and other areas of study, is to say that the assumption is that we're always going to be smarter. I talk about this in concert with a particular Onion article. Yes, I cite the Onion. It's called, the title of it is Study Dolphins Not So Smart on Land. And it takes the sort of things that we think are really smart to do, like can you navigate this obstacle course in a parking lot? And it suggests that, they're running dolphins through this. And I would suggest this is actually closer to life, to what we're actually doing in a lot of animal studies, where the assumption is that being smart means being like us. So I try to collapse that narrative in the work I do here. I tie this back into technological knowledge and philosophy of technology, but I think there's like two ways in which to read this book. One is for the middle chapters, where you're really interested about cool stuff animals are up to and a survey of the literature. The other is as a philosopher of technology, where you're trying to make sense of this literature in terms of our conversation is about innovation, about what we know and what we can know, and what it means to have knowledge that's not propositional, but witnessed in all the objects that exist. So it was really fun. I got to read great things.
Thanks a lot.